kicking off the day, Meri is honestly one of the best respected startup operators around, and she has seen multiple times this hyper growth stage that many people here will maybe be aspiring to go through or will be going through, and she really knows how when you grow teams fast, things break. And more than a lot of people, she knows maybe how to stop them breaking. I'm sure sometimes, they still break, but you know what's coming.
Minimum viable breakage is I think.
There we go, that's what we're aiming for. So Meri is many things and has done many things, but she's possibly most famous amongst this group as for the time she spent as the CTO at Monzo, where she grew the team by 5 times, which is quite a lot. She's also worked at M&S, the UK government digital service, the business card company Moo, and in 2020 she joined HealX, which is a drug discovery startup. But she's also the chair of the Lead Dev Conference and a tech advisor for the VC firm Kindred. Meri is the closest we get to a VC in this room right now.
I'm not evil though, nor a Kindred for the record.
So everyone here, Meri, will have experienced that moment where you're like, shit, the team got bigger and now things don't work like they used to work. What are some of those key inflection points that you've seen in companies and what changes at those moments?
Yes, I think there are a load of inflection points, as you say. So, fewer than 10 people, you get so much for free. Everybody knows what's happening. Everybody knows what the plan is. Any kind of the discussion in the office or in the Zoom call is the company strategy when you're that small. People struggle a little when they hit 20. There's some people in the group who don't have all of the context anymore when you've got 20 people. At 50, people want career paths and shit because the way to get promoted doesn't seem to be just hang around long enough anymore. And then the next, to be honest, I've seen there's all sorts of points at which it goes wrong between 50 and 150, but it's not super scientifically well established, but there's this concept of Dunbar's number, which is 150. Most people can't maintain relationships with 150 plus people. There's the occasional person who does that quite well. You get kind of super networkers, super connectors. But most people, when there's more than 100 people that they need to know, they don't anymore. And so you end up having to reconstruct or replace those things that have come for free at earlier stages into process or policy or whatever else.
So if someone here has 10 people right now, they're going to be 20 by the early next year. How can they practically prepare for that? Is there much you can do, or is it just you're going to have to go through this pain?
No, there absolutely is. I think so. The thing that tends to break between 10 and 20 is alignment. And so accepting now that somebody isn't being shit if they don't know what's happening, that maybe that's on you. So start investing when you're at 10, start investing in how do we make sure everybody knows what's happening without everybody having to be in every discussion and every meeting, because that doesn't work. It doesn't scale, literally. And so start investing sooner rather than later in how do you articulate what the goals are, what the focus is, in ideally as kind of easy a way as possible. I've seen very few teams successfully do OKRs at that. I've seen very few teams successfully do OKRs, full stop, let's be honest. Don't try to go too fancy, just try to be clear what's the focus and why. And I suppose accept that when you're still 10, it feels like extra work. But when you're at 20, 1 hour a week spent making sure everybody's on task and pointed in the same direction is time very well spent, even if at 10 it feels.
And who should be doing that? How long should it be the founders doing that? And at what point do you bring in a comms person or a people person or, people who know what they're actually doing with these things?
I mean, there's almost not a point that's too early, but it's usually about what you can afford. So I think the nature of all of those things that you can invest in, I suppose. It's a bit like tech, right? It's a lot cheaper to fix it or invest in it at the design stage or change something before you build it than after. So if you get your company all the way to 150 employees without a people person, well done. I hope you're all okay. But also the amount of people debt that they're going to have to deal with at the point that they join is mountainous if you wait that long. So what you see a lot of people doing is like, actually some of the best people, specialists I know, started out as office managers. And your amazing office manager who like just does everything, real kind of jack of all trades, can develop into a great people person. So I think some of it's about what you can afford and when, but the later you leave it to invest in pretty much any of these things, the more either, tech debt or policy debt or process debt will have built up.
And do you think there's, on that point about kind of training up people in-house, maybe your office manager or someone who just sort of takes an interest in organising stuff or like, thinking about those things versus getting in someone who's been there, done it, seen it before, but is more expensive? Is there, do you have any thoughts on a better, like when either route is a better fit for a company?
I think that the ideal is always to just keep investing in people that you've already got, because nobody cares more than them, nobody has more context than them. The thing to watch for is when does the kind of the growth of the company, the scaling of the company, outstrip what any human could keep up with. So if you're, going to go from being a team of 50 to a team of hundreds in a year, unless the person running that kind of recruitment, etc., talent process has already led much bigger teams or done that kind of volume of scaling, it possibly is more than even the smartest, best human could possibly keep up with. And I think that's the thing to watch for, because that's when you break people, is when the company, the needs of the company are, this kind of vertical scaling inflection, and even, the most amazing person can't keep up with the skill change and the experience change needed.
So if you do have someone like that on your team, they're an absolute superstar, but there's just no human way they could learn fast enough, how do you bring in someone above them, and how do you, I guess, break that to them without pissing them off so much they want to leave?
So it's a really interesting question. I think you can often bring somebody in below them who's experienced, and that can work fine. It means that you have to invest in their leadership capability really early and their management capability really early. But all companies are full of managers who know less than the people who are below them. And that sounds like a bad thing to happen, but like if you've been a manager for more than about 18 months, you probably can't do the job of everybody below you anymore. And you're just bullshitting yourself if you believe you can. So I think if you invest early, you can do that. The challenge tends to come when it's really senior leaders. And part of the reason it's a challenge is I think a lot of times when you bring somebody in who's more experienced or more senior, they expect a whole bunch of other stuff to already be there. And they get frustrated when it's not there. So I did a great panel thing at some point, can't remember exactly what it was, with Gustav, the CPTO at Spotify. And he was talking about how, realistically, pretty much all of the senior leadership at Spotify now are long-term Spotifyers, and they've grown up with the company. But they did bring all sorts of people in, when you're trying to figure out distributed streaming worldwide, there's 20 people in the world that you can go hire from, Google, Netflix, etc., who've already figured out that technical challenge. But what they found over the years was like very few of the people that they brought in from outside stayed for any kind of long term. A couple of people from Netflix stayed for 5+ years, I think. And so one of us asked him kind of like, okay, so what advice do you have for us if you bring really experienced people in, but then they get frustrated? That can't be good. And actually the approach that they're taking these days is to, even when somebody's expensive or whatever else, like deliberately bring them in as you're here for a certain period of time to get this leader through this next inflection point, through this bump, rather than to take over the area. And that's a tougher sell for some leaders. Like they don't all want to come in and be the mentor or coach rather than the one responsible for it all. But it often manages that frustration a bit better.
Do you think startups do invest enough in their kind of senior talent and their managers? Like, or maybe the question should be, what are some good examples of how startups do invest in them? You know, I've spoken to companies before where people have said, you should have, every single member of your leadership team should have a coach, and they should have this and they should have that. And then there's other companies where they're like, do you know how expensive a coach is? You know.
So I know that we're meant to be doing a VC-free day, but actually one of the things I really love about Kindred is they, as part of investing, provide a coach for the, at minimum, the founder, and found it to be so impactful in terms of company performance, the fund pays for it. So it's not like we'll invest in you and then we'll ask you to spend this money. Like, we spend the fund spends the money. And so I think particularly for kind of first-time founders or founder fundraiser is sometimes a thing. I think it makes a real difference to have a coach. For a lot of the people who are more of a domain specialist in some regard, like leading a function or whatever else, what can often help most is actually just having somebody as a mentor who's not too far ahead. And so people often try to get, like, you know, the super aspirational, you know, VP Eng at Google or whatever to be the mentor or the coach for their CTO. And the problems that person is facing with literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of engineers are so different to what any, like, fewer than 1,000 engineers CTO is gonna face, that it's not super helpful. And actually, when people are too expert, they're too far along the expertise curve, they're not great at explaining why they do things that they do. But nobody likes to be irrational. So you ask somebody who's just done something almost instinctively why they've done it, and that's the first time they think about why they did it, and they make shit up on the spot, not because they're trying to fuck you up or, like, lead you astray, just because we don't like being confronted with the reality that we're not making very conscious decisions a lot of the time. And so if your choice is between somebody who is, like, not expert yet, they're actively making these decisions, they're considering what they're going to do, their answer when you ask them why they did it that way and whether they do it differently now is just so much more real and so much more useful than somebody who the last time they made this decision was 5 or 10 years ago, because memory's imperfect and they're probably acting on instinct a lot of the time.
So do you think a kind of, like, if we're thinking funding stages, like a stage ahead, is that the kind of, like, level of mentor people should be?
Yeah.
And so that's for, like, super high performing employees. How should founders think about dealing with when someone just, you know, doesn't cut the mustard anymore? The company has moved on to a different stage and they're not growing fast enough. Is it you kind of have to just boot them out, or is it you maneuver them into some other position?
So I think it depends on whether they're the point where they're sort of plateauing is a career level or not. So it varies by discipline, but in engineering, if somebody's never going to get to senior in the current company, it's probably best for them to go somewhere else, because somebody else who would grow more rapidly could probably take the slot. But somebody who gets to that level that's like a perfectly acceptable career level, is doing good work, is delivering, it's all fine.
Because that junior will be kind of taking resources almost for the rest, and unless they're going to grow up, then that's not a good investment that the company is making.
Yeah.
And is that, do you see that as like a particular challenge with engineering teams because they're so darn hard to get hold of and really pretty expensive?
I mean, to be honest, like, yeah, with technologists, I'd almost always default to keeping and growing them, unless they're just not interested in the company, the domain. Like, some people do massively prefer to be in smaller teams, and people being aware of that and adapting to that is useful. Like, that self-awareness is valuable. And sometimes the pivot that's happened might mean that person's just not as interested in the company as they once were.
Yeah.
So I think it's more about whether their motivation to be there continues, because if somebody's motivated to be there, willing to put the work in, then everybody can learn, everybody can develop.
Yeah. And how do you think about what... So I'm sure literally everyone here has probably had a moment where they're like, I need a developer and I can't find any. And I've spoken to so many founders who say, like, we can't bring on board really junior developers because they're now really expensive. Senior engineers need to train them up, and then that's just not good for anyone. Have you seen any good examples of how people kind of
a true senior engineer has to be doing coaching and mentoring. So most senior engineers really love there to be more junior people. You've got to adjust your delivery expectations accordingly, though. So you have to invest. You invest now, take a small hit on velocity or productivity or whatever, but what you gain by having somebody who's bluntly probably full of energy and is going to find some work that your other engineers find boring really interesting and really it develops them. So I think it's a kind of penny wise, pound foolish approach to think that. But I also appreciate creating the room for it to be okay, for things to go a little bit slower because there's some people being trained up, can sometimes be really difficult. So my actual advice is spot the moment, do that anytime there's a lull, anytime where it could be okay for essentially your seniors to be working one day a week less on the core product or platform or whatever you're working on. Anytime that's the case, bring in more entry-level career, interns, whatever. But investing in interns, placement students, grads is a really, really good strategy. I think not to my credit at all, Jonas, who was the founder CTO and is now CTO again at Monzo, had invested in internships, and the director of engineering for security was an intern. Director of engineering for financial crime was an intern in the early days of Monzo, and they're fantastic. And you literally couldn't hire someone who has the context that they have, and by kind of growing up at Monzo, they've been surrounded by some of the best engineers around. So they're fantastic. And you wouldn't have created them any other way.
Yeah, and what are some of the, attitudes or aptitude, the characteristics you should be looking for? Maybe especially if you're hiring people into a smaller team or they're early on. And I guess if I also throw in there that also help you bring in more diverse people, that you're not, what are the things to look out for that might help you get out of the catch-22 of always hiring people who look the same and act the same?
So one of the key, just studies have shown one of the key things is to focus more on past performance than on potential. So we're really terrible as humans at spotting potential in people who look different to the leaders we're used to seeing. So if you have mostly seen one demographic become leaders, your ability to spot the future leaders in a group that's very different to that kind of look, feel, gender, way of speaking, etc., is very limited. And so I think a lot of times I've heard very early startup folks talk about I can see this person be my boss one day, and those are great things, but you have to recognize that you're not going to spot everybody who could be your boss one day, especially if they're different from you in some way. And so focusing a bit more backwards. And then some people are well, how can you do that if they're grads or interns, whatever? I grew up at Procter & Gamble. We had 100,000 applications every year for the 100 internships that we had in the UK. And even at that stage, I did my first internship at Procter when I was at the end of my first year of uni. They're already looking for examples of leadership, examples of decision-making, and just, improvement to things. Your context you were given that in was just, your part-time job or university or whatever else, rather than working life. And so the thing I see too few people invest in is that competency, HR people call it competency-based interviewing. So tell me about a time in the past when you... those kind of questions, because under pressure, people do what they've always done. The best people in the world, under pressure, they'll do what they default to doing. And so you need to know what people's defaults are. And you find that out by asking about how they've behaved in the past. Amazing.
So we are almost out of time, but Meri's sticking around at least for the morning if people want to pick her wise brain for things. But if you don't get to talk to her, Meri, what are some things anyone here who's kind of managing a team, growing a team, 3 things that absolutely need to go on their to-do list for 2022.
If you're about to rapidly scale, think about the things that are going to make a disproportionate, like, slowing down effect on the people who are joining. So onboarding, I've never regretted investing in onboarding. Mean time to productivity for new people, make that as short as it can be. I've never regretted, I've always felt like I was doing it too late when I invested in, like, technical writing or documentation or knowledge management. What Jen Lambourne, who we brought in at Monzo from the Government Digital Service, has made such a difference. And we brought her in when we had like 1,000 people in the company, and it would have been so much better if we brought her in when we were 500. So onboarding, documentation, but I don't mean like document the world. I mean like what's going to make it so the new people who join don't have to wait till somebody who was here 7 years ago or 6 months ago is around to explain something to them for them to get it. The third one, I think investing in people in the early stages, people have probably grown without you even noticing it, or certainly without you being super deliberate about it. At the point where the company's growth and individual growth are both going to need to do this in order to keep up, more actively investing in people's kind of leadership, people management, training, especially if they're going to start to manage somebody who's maybe more experienced than them, those kind of things tend to be super important to start investing in.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Meri. I hope you were all taking very good notes. I can actually see some notebooks, so this is a good sign. So.